Hello, thank you for joining me for tonight's edition of Protestia Tonight for the team of troublemakers over at Protestia.com. I am your host, David Morrill, taking the mic live. Again, this is twice in a week we're going live. Trying to get the program on a roll. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. Protestia Tonight is going to be hopefully twice a week. On a regular schedule, that kind of a thing. And if not, there will be automatic replays of prior episodes. At least that's what we're going to be trying to do. But this one is live, so feel free to join the chat and join the discussion. I see TJ there. How you doing, TJ? It's good to see the first message pop up. That means all the technology is working. That's good. It's a good thing. Anyway, you can follow what we're doing. You can read our work over at Protestia.com. Right before going live with this program, I published an article at Protestia and somehow broke the framework or the formatting or something like that on the website. I'm not entirely sure. I screwed something up. As far as I can tell, I messed something up. But the article that I put up there as I was messing something up, which I will fix when I'm done here, is entitled Christianity Today and Russell Moore, a Match Made in Hell. We're going to be discussing that on the program. But before we get to that, of course, a little bit of housekeeping. You can support what we do here at Protestia for only $5.95 a month by heading over to patreon.com/Protestia and subscribing for only $5.95. You can get the full version of this program, which includes the hour or so you're about to hear now and a follow-up hour or so that you will hear right after that, which we call, it's the patrons only portion. I'm going to try to come up with a better nickname for it. I'm thinking, I've had it suggested by one person that I see now is on the stream that it be called the VIP hour, or maybe like Protestia Tonight After Hours. I don't know. Something a little bit catchier than just the patron only portion. That sounds so utilitarian. But anyway, for $5.95 a month, you can get that half of the program as well. For $19.95 a month, you can join us on the Bulldogmatic Bible Study on Tuesday nights at 6:30 Mountain Time. We are currently in the book of 2 Corinthians, moving through it very slowly and methodically, which is how we like to do it in that format, and you can join us. There are other tiers of support if you feel so led. The most important thing, of course, is that your giving goes first and foremost to your local church. This program is a program for giving, loving, serving members of local New Testament churches. The information that we're going to talk about and hopefully the tools that we'll give you and the discussion that we will have is for churchmen and church women, I guess. I think we can just use churchmen generally, and we'll know that it applies to both men and women who are loving, giving, serving members of their local New Testament churches. If you are not a member of your local New Testament church and a Christian, you need to get that rectified, certainly before you start consuming polemical content or discernment content, because you really can only hurt yourself or others if what you learn here or what we expose or what we talk about is not used for the benefit, for the edification of your local body of believers, your local church. Church membership is something that we take pretty seriously around here, and this program is first and foremost for the edification of the church. We fancy ourselves as doing watchdog work, standing on the proverbial wall and defending against would-be wolves. We try to spot those wolves long out before they are inside the church consuming the flock. And of course, we got to expose those who are in churches consuming the flock. That's also part of the work that is done over here. We're going to get to some of that, as well as a little bit of a discussion about, I entitled this program, who can you trust, or how do you know who to trust, or something like that. Basically, we're going to discuss a little bit about how we try to figure out what we should and shouldn't believe, who we can and can't trust out there on the interwebs. In 2022, the town square, the proverbial town square, is happening online. It's happening on social media. It's happening in on blogs and videos and YouTube and all these other kinds of things. And it can be really difficult for believers to know when they see something or hear something, especially if it sounds good. to know whether they can actually trust what they're seeing, or even just trust the person saying it, you know. And so how do we navigate through that? We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're also going to talk about Russell Moore. Unfortunately, we're going to have to talk about Russell Moore, who is now the editor-in-chief, or soon to be the editor-in-chief over at Christianity Astray, is what we like to call it. Christianity Today, which is a long-standing publication, long-standing magazine or journal of evangelicalism. And the article that I just published, we're going to go through that and talk about why I think Russell Moore is just a great choice for this position. Why he makes perfect sense to be at the ripe young age of 50 years old or so, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. I think it makes a lot of sense, and we're going to talk about why. But before we get into those topics and whatever else pops into my 41-year-old head, before we get into that, let's talk about the gospel. If you've somehow stumbled onto this live stream or this video or this podcast, and you're wondering yourself, what is the gospel of Jesus Christ? You know, you guys keep talking about the gospel and gospel this and gospel that, and every quote unquote Christian influencer or speaker or author or whatever I see online is talking about gospel things. They're talking about gospel stuff. They're talking about how to live a gospel life and how to have gospel influence and how to have gospel finances and a gospel marriage. And they slap this term on just about everything. But what does the actual word mean? And what does it denote? Well, the word gospel, of course, is simply good news. When we say gospel, capital G gospel, we're talking about the good news of the person and work of Jesus Christ. And the good news is that while you were born into sin, and what is sin? Well, sin is an offense against God. Sin is believing or doing something that is against God's way, against God's truths. And that can be a condition of our heart or something that we do, even unknowingly by our nature. But the long story short, you and I and everybody except for Christ himself was born into sin. We were born as sinners, rebels against God, deliberately choosing to rebel against God. It is something that we are culpable for and will be held responsible for. And unfortunately, in this case, with a holy God, his standard of righteousness is unmoving. It doesn't move. And we have violated it by our very nature. And the consequences, the wages of sin, the payment, what we get in return for our sin is death. That is the judgment of a holy and righteous God. And yet the good news of the gospel is that God made a way for us to be reconciled to him, a way for us not to suffer those consequences, not to pay that price. And that came in the form of his son, Jesus Christ, coming to earth to pay that price for us. Jesus was born of a virgin. Now, why is a virgin birth important? It's important because Jesus Christ was born without the imputed sin of Adam. All of us that were born as sons and daughters of Adam, of Adam and Eve, originally were born with the sin. Jesus was not. He was conceived of the Holy Ghost, conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of a virgin, lived a perfect life. None of us were capable of doing that. He lived a perfect life and earned righteousness so that when he paid the price for our sin, when he was killed in our place, when he was the substitute for us on the cross, that sacrifice was real and effective, and he paid the price to the Father for us, for those of us that would believe and place their faith and trust in him. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you will believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you will repent of your sins. That's turn away from your sins. Come to a believing knowledge that those sins are wrong and turn from them. Salvation can be yours. You place your faith and trust in Jesus Christ for your salvation and not your own works. Jesus died on the cross, and on the third day he was raised from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit. And you and I, by believing and placing our faith in Jesus, can also be raised from the dead. We can become new creations, regenerate. Those of us that believe and have faith in Jesus are regenerate. We're new creations. We were born again. That's the good news of the gospel. If you have questions about that, please reach out to us. Comment here. Send us an email. You can email me now if you would like to, at david@protestia.com. I'll get that email if I've set it up right. I'm pretty sure I have. and I can answer those questions. We will always drop everything to have a conversation with you about the gospel. Now on to the news. At protestia.com, just put this up. Like I said, I sort of screwed up. I can tell that I did it. I somehow screwed up the formatting on the website, but I can kind of reformat it for these purposes. Christianity Today and Russell Moore, a match made in hell. Some of you may have seen earlier today that Russell Moore is going to become the editor-in-chief for Christianity Today. The funny thing about this, even before we get into the article, is a lot of Christians don't really know what Christianity Today is. It has become a very niche kind of a publication, especially with the explosion of the internet, and you can get really Christian news and information and commentary and all these kinds of things from all over the place. The influence of Christianity Today, which has been around for going on 70 years now, I think it was like 1954, 1955, that kind of range, that the magazine was first founded by Billy Graham. Their influence is really, it's really waned in the pew, like pew sitters. And you'll hear me talk about this comparison between pew sitting believers and, evangelical elites, or those in the platform, or those that are kind of in the evangelical intelligentsia. That's one of the other terms that we tend to use, which are those who are vocationally connected to Christianity, especially in terms of parachurch institutions. So things like seminaries and publications and media, outside the church kind of ministries. They're not necessarily just pastors who are laboring every week to preach sermons and serve their local congregations as under shepherds. These are folks that have other positions, created positions within the evangelical industry. Like evangelicalism, as it's popularly understood now, it's a relatively recent thing. It's a relatively recent thing, as especially media and especially information technology, the printed word, but especially with the invention of radio and television and all these sort of things, that really birthed this new way of doing Christian ministry in a lot of ways. The explosion of parachurch ministries that came about in the middle of the 20th century. Most of us, the vast majority of us at this point, have grown up with that just being a truth of our existence. We've only known, I'm 41 years old now. I've only known a Christianity that included things like magazines and recorded music and albums and books and documentaries and children's programming and VBS curriculum and all these other sorts of things that have become part of Christian culture. The Babylon Bee, for instance, satirizes Christian culture successfully, like all the time, and they're able to do so. There's a market for this because Christian culture is sort of its own thing. It's its own little world, and Christianity Today is still influential a little bit within that world, but especially among those who fancy themselves to be thought leaders within evangelicalism, and honestly, their buddies in the secular world. One of the things you'll notice if you look carefully is that leaders within evangelicalism, guys like Russell Moore, guys like Jerry Falwell, until recently, guys like Billy Graham and now Franklin Graham, these guys, they have all sorts of connections, not only within evangelicalism, where they're certainly influential, but even in other quote unquote Christian traditions, Catholicism. They got buddies that are Catholics, and they're probably at good speaking terms with Mormons and all sorts of other Christian sounding traditions. They're also buddies in a lot of ways with non-Christians, other religious leaders of other religions that they're usually on good terms with, and very often won't even bat an eye about partnering with those other religions to do quote unquote good things in the culture. Rick Warren of Saddleback Church is famous for this, famous for what we now term Chrislam, this joining of supposed Christians with Muslims for the sake of taking care of the material needs of the world or something, or doing needs-based ministry. And of course, that doesn't really add up to actual Christians, because we look at it and we say, but the reason that we feed the hungry, the reason that we clothe people, the reason that we take care of the poor is to present them with their real need, their ultimate need, which is for Jesus Christ. We can't do that with Muslims. We can't partner with Jews to do that kind of work. And so to the extent that we partner with other religions for the sake of material ministry, we're doing damage to the gospel. We're giving cover for those other belief systems. And Rick Warren's famous for this. But this is kind of a common thing among a lot of those in the evangelical industry or the evangelical intelligentsia. And Christianity today is sort of the, and I'm going to put this in quotes because I don't think it's conservative, but the conservative voice within those ecumenical conversations. So when some person out in the world, they're not a believer, they don't really understand church culture, they don't understand Jesus, of course, they don't know him, they're blind, but mainly they don't understand why evangelicals are the way that we are. They run to Christianity Today to figure it out. That's what we're talking about here. And so my argument in this article has been like, yeah, it makes perfect sense that Russell Moore should be the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. It's a match made in hell, and that's really what I put in the title here. I said, call me old-fashioned, but I still think that words should mean something. Take Christian, for instance, a word which identifies a person who believes in and practices the doctrines of Christianity. It's, obviously that's something we would take for granted, I suppose. A Christian is a person saved by faith in Jesus and who bears fruit in keeping with true repentance, and not just any Jesus, but the Word who became flesh and whose authority comprises the entire counsel of Holy Scripture. Christians believe and practice God's truths. Now, this is something that we would all just take for granted. We would all say, well, yeah, of course, that's what Christian means. So we would assume that a magazine calling itself Christianity Today would be populated by Christians. Christians would run the publication. I said, so imagine my surprise when the long-published evangelical magazine Christianity Today made the decision to promote their most notorious unbeliever, and yes, I believe he's an unbeliever, Baptist grenade tosser Russell Moore to the position of editor-in-chief. After all, if the word Christian means anything at all, having non-Christian employees at a Christian publication would seem to undermine the supposed purpose, especially if those employees held a position as important as editor-in-chief. Obviously, I wasn't surprised at all. In truth, Christianity Today is being consistent with its original purpose, which, according to founder Billy Graham, was to, and I was shocked that he just laid it out this clearly, but Billy Graham said back in '54 that the purpose of the magazine was to, quote, plant the evangelical flag in the middle of the road, taking a conservative theological position, but a definite liberal approach to social problems. So we see the birth of the evangelical industrial complex, the evangelical industry, whatever we want to call it. We see that in the middle of the 20th century. This is following the New Deal, right? So we have the Great Depression happening, and that, which really just, it really affected a generation. The greatest generation was so strongly affected by the Great Depression and then subsequently World War II that they were looking for governmental answers to a lot of societal problems, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought some of those in forms in the things like Social Security, things like basically the government, the United States federal government, getting much more involved in the material caring for people. That was the idea. And by the time that evangelicalism was becoming a thing, there was, as a term and sort of as a culture, there was certainly a propensity to lean that direction a little bit. And that's really where I think where Billy Graham was getting this idea, a definite liberal approach to social problems. According to Graham, Christianity Today would, quote, combine the best in liberalism and the best in fundamentalism without compromising theologically. Now, of course, I look at that and say that's not possible. It's not possible to stay uncompromising theologically and yet engage in, quote unquote, the best in liberalism. I mean, with my understanding of what liberalism is, I said, Graham's understanding of liberalism was undoubtedly different in 1954 than the unapologetic Marxism that the term liberalism denotes today. The magazine was purposefully, purposefully founded to stand in the middle of the worldly road and bridge the divide between truth and falsehood. A biblically offensive concept. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? And, or what fellowship has light with darkness? This is, when people talk about fundamentalism, or people talk about, hey, you're stubborn, you're unmoving, you're radical, whatever it is, in terms of your Christianity, it's based around the simple concept that there is one truth. God's truth, and things that vary from God's truth must be challenged and corrected. There's not some sort of a spectrum of truth. And yet we see Christianity today being founded with this idea that, hey, the old way of doing it, where we just proclaim gospel truth unapologetically and we don't move from it, and we try to advance God's truths and his law and his ways in the broader culture, that's an old-fashioned way. That won't work. How can we instead, as Billy Graham seems to have been advocating back in 54, said, how can we supposedly stay theologically sound and yet embrace things that are supposedly good about liberalism, embrace things that are supposedly good about more government involvement in people's lives, and the government being an active participant in in taking care of people. And we see this sort of idea in more modern times with guys like Rick Warren, who thinks that the church is just one arm, religion and the church is just one arm of all the things necessary to make a better world. Rick Warren's peace plan, where he's basically advocating for partnering with secular governments, making everything purpose-driven, and the church just being one component of several things that, when all put together, provide the right answer. So the right answer isn't simply God's way; it's God's way plus a few other things, plus a few other components, plus partnership with Islam and partnership with Judaism and partnership with Catholicism and all these other things. That's an old idea, and in terms of Christianity today. Russell Moore is going to become the editor-in-chief, I guess, the beginning of September, whatever. But he fits very, very well into this idea. I said, rather than shine a light into a darkened world, Billy Graham's evangelicals and the newly defined evangelical establishment embraced a middling third way that more closely resembled the Christian democracy style communitarianism, that defines the ethics of Russell Moore. In other words, having an editor-in-chief who advances social justice, bullied Christians into submitting to compelled vaccination, and ripped churches that grew due to their faithfulness and not closing down during the pandemic fits Christianity today perfectly. And Russell Moore claims to have begun reading Christianity today at age 15 and being electrified by former CT editor-at-large Philip Yancey. Some of you may be familiar with that name. Philip Yancey is he grew up in the Jesus people 70s, continues to carry that ethos with him, but to the point where he compromises on things. He showed up and a while ago now, maybe 10 years ago, showed up at some event being held by Christianity, some sort of a gay Christianity group. Yeah, the Gay Christian Network is what it was called. But Philip Yancey, he's theologically very liberal. He actually lives around here. He lives close to Denver, as far as I know, in Colorado area. So maybe I can have him on the program. I don't think he'll come on, but and Philip Yancey, according to Russell Moore, helped Russell Moore see the racism, immorality, violence, and legalism that was occurring in Christian subcultures. And this is sort of like a trap phrase that they use. Well, there's Christian subcultures. So this is the same sort of intersectionality, but applied in a negative way. So in the same way that somebody might be gain virtue or gain authority and some moral authority in some sort of a situation by fitting certain intersectional demographics, by being female or being black or being Latino or being homosexual, whatever it is. The same way that people can gain for themselves virtue and authority in ways, it can be done in reverse. So if they look at these so-called Christian subcultures, they would divide up Christians into groups that, hey, that group is emphasizing patriarchy. That group is emphasizing being for their country, being a nationalist. This group is emphasizing this thing over here. They would divide Christianity into subcultures, and not particularly doctrinally defined subcultures, but more culturally defined. I mean, you know that by the word. It's a subculture, meaning it's a cultural definition, a cultural change. And then of course we can look in those subcultures and say, well, they're being racist. Well, they're being violent. Well, they're being legalistic about this thing. They keep telling us that women can't preach, or they keep telling us that homosexuality is a sin, and you can't be a Christian and be an unrepentant sinner like that. Russell Moore understood these when he first started reading the liberals of Christianity Today, including Philip Yancey. His life as I call him a confessional and convictional chameleon. Some of you may know that he started his political career as an advisor to a Democrat. Russell Moore's been a lifelong Democrat until supposedly 2014, when this guy, I guess, switched to Republicanism. So yes, flipping over from Democrat to Republican, Russell Moore has described himself as a lifelong Baptist. But he left the SBC and now he was at Ray Ortland's Presbyterian Church. He's aligned himself with Anglicanism in some capacities. I have to assume, because Christianity Today is in the Chicago area, that he'll probably move up to Chicago, because he was living in Nashville and he was in Tennessee. But Chicago is, and especially the Chicago suburbs, are just a hub of extreme liberal, quote unquote, Christianity. That's where you go to Chicago Seminary, Chicago Theological Seminary, which is one of the most radical seminaries in the world. It's where a lot of progressive Christian thought and experimentation. It's where Julie Roys hangs out. She's in suburban Chicago. It's just a hotbed of sort of this, and I would argue, dying liberal mainline sort of Christianity. It's where you can go to Baptist churches and schools that, when you really just dig under the surface, like, there's nothing Baptist about them in terms of what actually makes a Baptist or a Baptist church. I have to assume he's going to move up that. He's going to move up that way. Andrew's saying, yeah, Moody is also up there. Yeah, that's where Julie Roys was, right? She wrote for Moody and did the radio show, and then when she went sideways with the leaders there for whatever reason and decided to do her own thing, there were still plenty of liberal patrons to support her work, including Judson University, which considers itself a conservative Christian school, and yet they host seminars and speakers and things talking about critical race theory and advancing social justice and promoting false gospels and things like this. That's what Christianity Today is up there, and no doubt it was heavily influenced by these ideas. Other things that make Russell Moore a chameleon. He's supposedly a Calvinist in terms of his soteriology, and yet he capitulates to the world all the time, which is not consistent with actual Calvinism, with actual Reformed soteriology. This idea that if we believe salvation is the work of God alone, and that he regenerates the heart before anybody is even capable of making a decision to choose him, faith itself, the faith to and opening your eyes to believe, is a gift from God. It doesn't make a lot of sense to be constantly capitulating to the world. Those two things are inconsistent. There is and you can look this up, I'm not going to go through it right now, but there is a a school of thought or a theological school entitled, called Christian democracy. And I used that earlier. I said that his middling third way, or the middling third way of guys like Russell Moore, resembles Christian democracy. Look that up. That's a fairly common ethical system used by guys like Russell Moore, and by a lot more of the evangelical establishment than we realize. And it's basically, to sum it down, and I may not get this entirely accurately, but it's basically trying to take traditional Christian moral values and fuse them with a wider secular society humanism. And so we take, if I'm a Christian, an advocate of Christian democracy, and you see in communitarianism, I basically take my Christian values and I try to say, okay, these can work or agree with even folks outside of the church within the culture at large, and it can be fused together. We can do work together. It's what Billy Graham was saying back in 54, when he was saying that they were going to try to take the best parts of liberalism. They looked at political liberalism and saw a government-driven activism, social welfare activism within the political culture of the day, that was within the budding political culture of the day. And they said, hey, we can sort of use this as well. We can agree with this. We can partner with this as Christians to advance to advance the larger good of society. And Russell Moore falls into that category. It's just not theologically consistent if you actually get underneath it. And it certainly doesn't make a lot of sense being a supposed Calvinist. I said that these positions of Russell Moore's prepare him perfectly to head up a publication whose name implies sensitivity and concern with the latest thing. And Moore's jaw-bending Southern delivery is primed to disarm all but the most vigilant Bereans. Jaw-bending, I mean, like, there's got to be some sort of a medical term for this. I don't know what it is. There's got to be some sort of a medical term for guys that when they talk, their jaw just sort of goes. You see it with like Mike Huckabee. I've seen it with a lot of Southerners, and I'm not a Southerner, so I don't know if it's a thing or not. But I find it very interesting that they just sort of, when they talk, I can't even do it right. Watch Russell Moore speak or watch Mike Huckabee speak, and you see this. I don't know what it is. But his delivery, it's disarming, right? It's a sort of soft spoken, like a Southern drawl that just it gets people to it makes you sound humble, even if what you're saying is just not humble at all. That's it works for him. I said, much like founder Billy Graham, Russell Moore sees Christianity today as the voice of the evasive third way, where you can be conservative on paper, liberal in practice, befriending all and loving none. Rather than the Christianity once and for all delivered to the saints, Christianity today will continue to promote a Christianity of today. Bending to the desires, lofty ideas of the culture it inhabits, Russell Moore is an ideal person to lead a publication that has one foot in the church and the other in the world, and an ideal representative of modern evangelicalism's unholy union between light and darkness. So, yeah, this shouldn't, Russell Moore being now named editor-in-chief is no surprise to anybody. The good news is I don't think any regular Christians read Christianity Today. I don't think they do. I think it's more in the same way that Republican politicians think that whatever the mainstream media is saying at the time is somehow what everybody thinks. Like, the mainstream media is really good at convincing conservative and Republican politicians, really good at convincing them that this is what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks this way. It's never true. Christianity Today falls into that category, where even the Baptist press now, to an extent, the Southern Baptist Convention's media outlet, they have this way of convincing conservative theologians that that everybody thinks this. But I really think that Christianity Today is influential in academia to an extent, and in the broader influencer, folks that make their living being professional Christian influencers. Yeah, see, Doctrinal Watch, yeah, Communism Today, exactly. Well, since you jumped on, head over to my at Protestia.com. I just published this, I don't know, less than an hour ago. Christianity Today and Russell Moore, a match made in hell. So I got in trouble with my church the very first time I wrote about Russell Moore. I'm not going to stop because he really is just a great representation of what is wrong in popular evangelicalism. He still remains that. So that article's over there. Moving on to our next topic that I queued up today. And this is another Christian publication over at, and this was published earlier today as well, over at capstonereport.com. Marvin Olasky formed secret racial sensitivity committee at World. Like, I can see some watching this video or listening to this podcast saying, World what? What are we talking about? Like, I've heard of Christianity Today or Christianity Astray. World Magazine, which I'm going to flip over here if I can so you can see what I'm talking about. Well, here's and they say and it is, honestly, it is more theologically sound than Christianity Today. I mean, I know that's a low bar to step over. But this is World Magazine, WNG.org, sound journalism grounded in facts and biblical truth. And generally, it's, like I said, it is more theologically sound, certainly more conservative culturally than Christianity Today. But the headline over at Capstone is Marvin Olasky, who I think it might have been last year stepped down as he was like editor-in-chief at World Magazine, had a racial sensitivity committee that oversaw their editorial work. Now, World Magazine will publish articles by Al Mohler and Allie Beth Stuckey. And I mean, those that think, conservative voices. Now, Al Mohler, you know what problems we have with Al Mohler. I think he's one of the most dangerous men in the church right now because he comes across pretty respectable and conservative, and yet behind the scenes, he's duplicitous. Behind the scenes, he hires CRT promoting seminary professors and fires those that don't support it. He's the consummate politician. But this is over at World. The New York Times, I don't know if this will pull up, but the New York Times profiled. Yeah, it might not let me do it because I don't subscribe to the New York Times, and I probably won't. Oh, I've reached my limit of free articles. That's my problem. Whatever. But anyway, over at Capstone, we're talking about World Magazine having a secret committee apparently at the magazine that would review the publications or the articles or things posted on there and determine if it was racially sensitive enough. I guess World Magazine had this committee was anonymous. Nobody knew who it was, but I guess they would either correct or chastise people or whatever if their articles weren't racially sensitive enough. One of the things that really got them was when Daryl Harrison, some of you know Daryl Harrison from the Just Thinking podcast. Yeah, so I see the comments there. Andrew saying someone should start a fund to get me more articles. Yeah, I don't want anybody to fund my subscription to the New York Times. We'll figure out a technological way around that. But this is at the supposedly conservative World Magazine. It got really the people that work at World supposedly got really upset that Daryl Harrison was on a podcast over there and was not didn't accept the George Floyd narrative. This article was from so this is when Megan Basham was at World. So we're going back a little ways. This is back in 2020. Megan Basham had Daryl Harrison on the podcast. And the transcript is here, but basically talking about, it sounds like they're talking about George Floyd and Daryl Harrison saying, I'm not buying the narrative here. I'm not buying the narrative that this was racially based. This is the narrative that was bought hook, line, and sinker by guys like J.D. Greer and Ed Litton and Russell Moore and a lot of these other evangelical leaders just said, well, George Floyd is black. this officer is white, that equals racism, despite the fact there wasn't evidence of this. And so Daryl Harrison's on with Megan Basham, and apparently that got all the staff at World Magazine all hot and bothered that they would have someone on there on their podcast that wasn't buying the George Floyd narrative. Back to the Capstone article. It says Harrison, the Just Thinking podcast, of course, which he hosts with Virgil Walker, who I think he calls him Omaha all the time, which I find hilarious. Like, if I ever have a co-host on this program again or something like that, I'm going to come up with a name and just call him that. And I realize that's not much of a nickname, but it is one of the things that entertains me about listening to the Just Thinking podcast. It says, the article says, having a black man speak about the George Floyd protests roiled the world newsroom. So perhaps it wasn't Daryl Harrison not buying the narrative, although I suspect he doesn't buy the narrative about it being racially based, but he was taking issue with the protests. He was saying, even if it was racially based, this isn't the answer. You can't go burn down buildings and throw Molotov cocktails through the windows of courthouses and things like this. And so the article asks, Capstone article asks, if Harrison was not acceptable to the woke commissars, who would be? Marvin Olasky praises, here's his two favorite podcasts to listen to while he's walking his dog, David French and Justin Gibney. Some of you might have seen Justin Gibney talking with David French very recently, about what the answer is supposed to be within conservative evangelical circles, about as far as reparations. And the tweet is right here. I'm going to see if this will play for us.
The Protestant church in the U.S. is just a whole bunch of brand new institutions, right? You've got all kinds of non-denominational churches that have sprung up in storefronts, for example. They have a history, but it might be to 2011, that particular church. What do you say to a lot of these much newer Christian institutions? There's all kinds of them in evangelical spaces that have exploded. And
now, real quick, what does French mean when he says evangelical spaces? Well, he's talking about the marketplace. The marketplace. I've told pastors of my church this several times when they were wondering about the value of discernment ministry specifically, and I said, look, when members of this church leave, whether it's like Sunday or Wednesday night or whenever they're at church, and during their other times, they're still consuming media. They're still being exposed to all sorts of things out there claiming to be Christian, all sorts of things claiming to be of God, claiming to be about Jesus, claiming to be reputable. And so we have to do that work out in the public square as well. We have to do that work too. And that's really how I defended doing this podcast, for instance, or doing programs like this, or writing articles at Protestia. Like, the folks that are being fed all this garbage in the name of Jesus need an answer in the same space. And then they can come back with that to their churches and say, hey, I know you're about to put this book over here from Richard Foster on your bookshelf, but let me tell you about Richard Foster. He's been exposed by Protestia, or he's been exposed by Capstone or Dissenter, whoever it is. A lot of the other guys doing this kind of work. It is true. It is true that evangelical spaces is a woke way to talk. And I like, by the way, maybe I asked this before. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me why David French sounds the way he does. I realize this may sound a little petty, a little judgy. I don't know. But is there somewhere that you go to be trained to talk like this? Are there certain colleges where if you attend these colleges, you start sounding like David French? I don't know. I mean, I guess you got to start by maybe growing up in the South and then going to like Eastern Academia or something. I don't know. I don't know where he's gone to school, but I have to assume that it's got to be something like that, because I don't hear men speak this way. I mean, listen to it again.
The Protestant church in the U.S.
The Protestant church. What's the Protestant church?
Is just a whole bunch of brand new institutions.
A whole bunch of brand new institutions. Like, if I start sounding that way, please, somebody put a bunch of exclamation points in the chat. I cannot figure out how one begins to speak this way. Where does this come from? Is there a special island of woke evangelicals where they all learn how to talk like this? It's like the Ned Flanders school of talking for evangelicals. And if you want to sound respectable and you don't want to offend people, especially, if they're women listening, you know how sensitive they are. They won't listen to you at all if you're a man and you don't sound like this. I seriously, I don't get it. I'm going to try to get through this without making fun of him too much. Sorry. Yeah. He he doesn't eat enough red meat. I think you're onto something.
Right. You've got all kinds of non-denominational churches that have sprung up in storefronts, for example. They have a history, but it might be to 2011. That particular church.
Like the only friends I have, and they are friends. They know what I believe and my concerns about their lifestyle. But the only friends I have that speak this way are homosexuals. And we've talked about this on prior podcasts a long time ago. There's a documentary, I think it's floating around on Netflix or maybe Hulu, that is about, quote unquote, homosexual speech patterns, and that it's a learned behavior. It's the same way that you find wokesters walking around with masks outside to make sure that everybody knows what team they're on. Homosexuals and effeminate and effete men apparently learn this sort of a speech pattern, so you know what camp they're part of. It's like a secret handshake. So if you walk up to someone and you order your latte like this, and you walk up to the barista and you say, "I will have a soy macchiato with 2 squirts of espresso," and you make an order this way. Like, you can't walk in a Waffle House and make that order, right? You can't your server comes up to you at Waffle House. You're not gonna be like, what do you have on a nitro? What do you have on nitro tap? I'll have the number 2 platter with extra syrup and 2 waffles and 1 pancake in the middle. If I could, they won't know what you're talking about. I don't know. It's definitely a cultural thing. And like I said, I'm not a Southerner. I'm live in the suburbs. So I guess I don't really fit equally into either camp, but I don't understand this. I don't understand this. All right. I think I've made fun of him enough about the way he's taught. I guess I got to do a segment on Kyle J. Howard next, so I can get the David French style of talking out of my vernacular and start talking like Kyle J. Howard again.
What do you say to a lot of these much newer Christian institutions? There's all kinds of them in evangelical spaces that have.
Dude, what's an evangelical space? They planted a church over here. It's a church 2.0 church. It's called, Redemption Church is pretty right down the middle. If you call your church Redemption Church, those are I think Babylon Bee has a whole scale of this kind of stuff where they're kind of how advanced or how market savvy is your church really? And these churches come up with made up terms, Center Point Church, or it's a Life Renewal Brigade Church or something, I don't know.
That have exploded and grown up since the end of slavery, since the end of Jim Crow. And they're going to look at you and say, "Justin, what are you talking about? My institution that I'm a part of had nothing to do with it. I have had nothing to do with it. Yet this institutional analysis doesn't make any sense to me because we're not a seminary that benefited from slavery. We're a church that started with 23 people in an old, an old 7-Eleven building 15 years ago. What do you?
I would say that you're part of a culture and institutions that have benefited in general, right? So it's, even whenever we look at sin or when we look at Christian ethics, you got to look at the spirit of it. Because if we want to get out of something, if we want to be overly technical and be lawyers like you and I are, we can do that. I wouldn't do that with God, though. And I think if you really look at the spirit of, honestly, if you really look at the spirit of what that ethic is saying, have I in direct or indirect ways had a benefit? And even if I didn't, has something been taken from somebody? What is my responsibility? So yeah, we can get technical. We can say, well, if you look at this, we didn't we weren't the ones. We shut this organization down and started something new. Yeah, but the benefits of that old institution still flow in one way or another to the new institutions, right? Even if it isn't a line item in the budget, right? There's still ways that flow from one to the other. So you got to look at the spirit of it, and Christians know that in other spaces. We know that in other situations, but we want to get very technical and just find ways to get out of it. You can convince yourself of that. I would be worried that you could convince God of that, and so we need to look at it a little bit.
Now, of course, what is he doing? Well, he's advocating for reparations. He's advocating for, since you benefited from all of this institutional stuff. You have white skin after all. You started a church with a bunch of white skinned people. Doesn't matter that it's a strip mall and everybody's on free and reduced lunch. That doesn't matter. Obviously you benefited from it. So the only way you're going to get out of that is by giving up your privilege, giving up your reparations, giving us reparations. That's what he's advocating for. And French is just I really wouldn't be, I wouldn't be able to say anything otherwise. that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, but the interesting part about this is, these two dudes are who the, I guess former now at this point, editor of World Magazine, a supposed conservative journal, is listening to. This is Marvin Olasky. The two podcast hosts I listen to the most while walking my dogs are David French and Justin Gibney. If you're not familiar with them, this podcast will introduce you to both. And then, of course, you come to find out that this is just a symptom of the bigger problem, where he had commissioned some sort of a racial sensitivity task force, secret task force at the magazine. So yeah, and if you go back through Olasky's tweets and things like that, he's in this camp with Russell Moore and these other elites of being never Trump, of saying because and the truth is, I don't have a lot of time here left on the free side, but the truth is that Donald Trump's, it was his positions a little bit, and they like to blame it on his personal immorality, but it was his culture that made these people the most upset. It was the fact that Donald Trump spoke plainly and directly and sort of, and coarsely. I see Jammy Starfish. That's a good name. That's why Basham left World Magazine. Daily Wire allows her to name names, but editors at World wouldn't allow it. Yeah, I totally believe that, obviously. The proof is in the pudding here. These guys they pal around together. They want to rub shoulders with secular journalist elites. They want to be the Christian at the cocktail party with the New York Times and with the Wall Street Journal and with the Washington Post. That's what they really want. They want to be loved and respected by the world. And we know as believers that when we say things that are true, that are God's truth, not only will the world not respect us, they will revile us. They'll persecute us potentially. That's the spiritual battle that's going on here when it comes to the God's truth versus the lies of the world. There's no magical Russell Moore third way where you can supposedly preach true gospel and true Christian things and really advocate for biblical truth. And the elites are going to be like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I'm good with it. Never mind that I'm lost and am in full rebellion against God. That's that's the crazy part about it, is you can't please the world and please God at the same time. And we're talking about says in the article, Olasky's love for secular elite news outlets is mutual. So David Brooks, who's the simp, the pet simp conservative at the New York Times, was listed Olasky as one of the few heroes of the revolution, saving American evangelicalism from Donald Trump, or white Christian nationalism, or some other boogeyman. And by the way, we're going to do a program, hopefully next week, we'll see, specifically addressing this boogeyman. It is a boogeyman of Christian nationalism. We're going to discuss that. It is becoming a hot button term defined by the world to mean things it really shouldn't mean. Like if you take the term Christian and you take the term nationalist in isolation, neither one of them is a negative. In fact, nationalism and the existence of nation states that citizens would advocate for before they would advocate for other nation states is something that's entirely biblically supportable. We see in Revelation worship of God by people of all tongues and tribes. Well, what is a tribe? A tribe is a nation state. Tribe is a nation. This is indicating that nations will go all the way to all the way to the end of the world. And without getting too deep into it, it makes perfect sense to be a quote unquote nationalist. It makes perfect sense because you have no ability to care for people out there if you can't care for people that are close to you. So it's family and it's church and it's community, and then it's to the far reaches of the world. And we should be taking the gospel there for sure. But in terms of material caring for one another, it's not possible to do outside of your local sphere effectively. That's a trap argument to say if you're rooting for your country, you care about your country, you're clearly a bad person because it means you don't care about other places. It's like, no, but on a practical level, I'm not able to. So this nation takes care of this nation takes care of this nation, and so on and so forth. But we're going to get into that in a subsequent podcast, I'm sure. That's going to get us to the end for this one. I appreciate everybody jumping on and watching. If you're a patron, stay on the there's a link in Patreon where I posted this. There's a link to flip over to the patron portion of the podcast, and I will see you over there. For those of the Hey, thanks, Andrew. I appreciate that, man. He says that I'm going to log on Patreon and get the full show. I appreciate that very much. It's, do the $5.95 a month one, see if you like it. Patreon.com/Protestia. I appreciate the support very much. For the team at Protestia, I'm David Morrill, and I will see you next time. As always, Semper Reformanda.